here a long time ago. One or two of you kind of may remember it. It was here, actually, when the sort of graduate design was kind of set up, and indeed, actually, Michael Hensel, the piano tuner I see here, you know, it's been away for some time now, and we're incredibly glad to have the piano back again, even at great cost. You can see it's surrounded by some sort of quasi-architectural form of signification, indicating that somehow construction hasn't happened yet, but perhaps will do in the near future. So on your behalf, I'd like to welcome the piano and also Jeff Kipnis, who's going to play it. Jeff, thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and everyone, and it's great to be back in London at the AA and see old friends. I thought it'd been 8 years or so since I've been here. Someone told me I'd given a lecture here 6 years ago, which I'd forgotten about. And if that's the case, 90% of the slides are the same. I'll try to say something different about them, but please don't tell anybody. I showed the film I made earlier today, which is really, I made that film so I didn't have to do this anymore because this makes me really nervous. And so I thought, since I'm a really bad pianist, the thing that would really help me to make me even more nervous is to actually play in front of y'all. So anyway, the reason I mentioned the film is two things. One of the things that's incredibly frustrating about giving a lecture like this is you're there, you come once a year, you give an hour lecture, and then you leave, and you know, you can't help but leave the impression that you just told everybody everything you've thought about. And it's very frustrating because all of y'all are thinking about all kinds of stuff all the time. You came all the way from Hong Kong for me. That was so a chance to actually speak to several issues in the same day is really something I really appreciate. This is my first PowerPoint lecture ever. I bought a slide scanner 2 days ago, and I have no idea. All I'm telling you is I have no idea how long the lecture will last. You're just getting, you know, like when it's real physical slides, I know exactly what I'm doing. I know when to go. The thing clicks, and you know, I put a bunch of them in there, and the thing turns out to be really fun. So you just go around and scan everything. I sat on the scanner. It turns out not to work just as good as the Xerox machine. So anyway, before we get started, though, some of y'all saw the film today, and the film was about the work of Frank Gehry, and there's a significant portion in the film that deals with the relationship between Frank Gehry and Robert Rauschenberg. And even though I'd finished the film, I continued to do some research, and partly in honor of somebody I really miss and really care about, Charlotte Coudril, and I wanted to show this little continuation of the work that I've done on that subject, which is basically what's the relationship between Rauschenberg and Gehry. So I'm going to start showing just a few slides. So can we turn this on? Anyway, this is archival material which I discovered, which I believe is the first ever discovery of this really profound and unexpected relationship between Robert Rauschenberg and Frank Gehry. And I think it speaks for itself. So yeah. So this, of course, is the very first showing of Rauschenberg's monograph at the Jewish Museum in 1962. And I think you'll see this speaks for itself. And so, you know, this is unpublished as of yet, but I thought you'd appreciate it. The name of this lecture is called To Be Dressed or Not to Be Dressed, and it has lots of antecedents, and I can't quite tell you. I've been working on the problem of disciplinary specificity for a while, considering the mess that I caused with my colleagues in the post-structuralist heyday of getting rid of all reasons to do anything anywhere by clever arguments. I thought I owed it to my discipline to go back and see if there was really anything I could say about architecture itself instead of all the theoretical chaos that we caused. And anyway, so I've been working on the problem for a while. It meant I had to go back and read phenomenology again and look at some of the arguments that were being used to discuss the nature of architecture as a specific discipline. And but really, this lecture, which is the to be dressed or not to be dressed, started when I was with Zaha Hadid in Vienna, and we were looking at some student work, and all of a sudden, this young student walked up with a body cast. And see, that's not funny to you, but Zaha and I looked at each other and thought, oh my God, here we go again. For 10 years at the AE in particular, every project was a body cast. And every project was cast this part of the body, cast that part of the body, sit in the cast, you know, and it was all about turning the body through plaster into buildings on the basis of on an argument about the phenomenology of the body. And I started to wonder, you know, why were those people that did all those body casts, why were they always naked when they did their body, you know? Why is the body, as such, naked? You know, I calculated that I spent, in my life, in my adult life, of the 52 years I've spent alive, I think I've only been naked about a year. I mean, if I were to add up the net time of nudity, you know, I can't, you know, why would the phenomenology of the body always mean it was naked? And so I became really interested in this problem of dress. And later on, you'll see in the show that, I mean, you'll see in the lecture that, you know, that it'll turn into a couple of issues, particularly a critique of the added value problem. So when I noticed, I was reading Merleau-Ponty, probably the most important, I guess, text in phenomenology in architecture is Merleau-Ponty's text. Something quite interesting about it, and that is, in its roughly 300 pages, it never mentions the word history until 20 pages from the end, and only in relationship to the discussion of freedom. So the phenomenology of perception, although there's chapters on the body, the longest chapter in the book is on the body, there's a long chapter on temporality, the idea of history finds its way into discussions of phenomenology with great difficulty and ill at ease. And what I thought was important for me is to see if there would be a way to argue about the specificity of the practice, not as historically determined, but as materially determined in such a way that in respect of its history. Architecture changes really fast. This is Robert Smithson's house from 1570 before he went to Italy. Not Robert Smithson, the long-lived sculptor, but Robert Smithson, the other guy. I think he probably spelled his name with a Y or something. He did something different. I don't know what it is. But, you know, he then goes to Italy and visits Palladio's work, and he comes back a Neo-Palladian, or what they call a Neo-Jacobian. I'm not quite sure why in Italy, in England, if you're a Palladian, you're called a Neo-Jacobian. But, so, you know, 20 years later, he does this house, and this is a house for Edith Hardwick Hall. And the change in plan from the centralized medievalism of the Great Hall, in which you go through layer upon layer upon layer to get to this plan where you walk directly from the outside into the Great Hall, it was in part because of a new social regime and the significance of the party. But the other thing is this shift in style occurred in roughly 20 years, which is roughly the same rhythms that is occurring today. The idea that architecture today is somehow faster and publication makes it go faster, it's really not true. The high Renaissance, even in painting, has really only lasted 20 to 25 years. And so the movements of architecture as a discipline have to be understood to be historical, and the difference between this one and this one have to, if there is going to be a specificity to that, have to be grounded in those changes. Most importantly, we can't ask ourselves questions like, what is a house? I mean, if this is a house and this is a house, then whatever's going on here can't be about that question. So if the phenomenology argument is always going to ask itself the essential question, what is architecture, what is a house, it's never going to be able to capture the historical movements of the materiality. And that means, now, that says waltz chat, so here goes. I don't know if I can actually, if I really have the nerve to do this, but I'm supposed to play some stuff now. So before we get going, let me just ask somebody, somebody I don't know, which is really strange. What is a waltz? Come on, easy answer. What's a waltz? The dance. The dance. The dance. Actually, what's interesting about the dance is that in 1597, roughly the same time the Hardwick Hall was being started, the construction was started, a royal decree outlining what was permissible in dances, in royal balls, was issued because a certain kind of folk dancing was starting to show up in the royal ball. And so certain rules, which were these. No, sexes couldn't mix. They could dance in parallel to each other, but they had to stay in their own groups. There could be no touching of men and women, and no spinning. Spinning, most of all, was considered. And what the dance that was showing up was called the Landler. Now, if you know if you know anything about Germany, the Landler is like it's a drinking song, and you have a few beers, you drink, and then you start to spin and touch, for God's sake. And it was like one of the worst things you could ever possibly do. So what happened, the evolution of the Landler into the waltz is actually one of the great issues in the social history of music, because the waltz was the first court dance, or first dance permitted in the court, where you were allowed to dance with a partner, physically touch, and of course spin. And so what I thought I'd like to do now is look at the history, or a little bit of the history of the waltz. Ask ourselves, we started with the question, what is a waltz? And we answered with a dance, and we locate something about its history. And then I want to ask, is that a true question, and have we achieved a true history? And perhaps outline another possible way to think about the question, and then apply it to architecture. So let's see. So what have I played for you so far? The Landler I did. Okay. So in a piece that you're going to know, the waltz went through lots of variations, and you know them. Oh, wait. Does anybody know what this is? Anybody want to guess what that is? You're wrong if you think it's a mistake. Okay, so you know the waltz. But, do you know this piece? Let's see if I get this right. Anybody know that? The beginning of the Third Symphony by Beethoven. It's the Eroica Symphony. And so the question comes to mind is this. In a symphony, put the light back on, I'll tell you when to take it off. I got to be able to see. In a symphony where people are seated in the audience, why would you start with a dance form? I mean, it's an interesting question. Why would he start a piece of music with a piece which in its essence is a dance if you were going to sit there and listen to it and not get up and dance? And the answer is pretty obvious in a certain way, and that is, by that point in time, the dance form as a piece of musical composition had evolved far enough that it could start to produce other effects and other histories. And since he was writing the Eroica Symphony to celebrate, as you know, originally dedicated to Napoleon, the arrival of a certain argument about freedom and the importance of the common man, it was the perfect piece of music to start with. So he starts the symphony with a piece of music that everyone would recognize having the history of touching, the history of spinning, the history of having moved from the Landler to the waltz. And so it was a really important musical device to let him move into telling the story he's about to do. But at that point in time, we have to detach ourselves from the question of the waltz as a dance and the waltz as a musical form that the composers are going to get to use to do other things. So that keeps going, and then, so I've gotten through the two hard pieces. This is the Mephisto Waltz, which is one of the hardest pieces of music ever written, and I'm going to actually not be able to do very well with it. So the next thing I thought I'd play for you is the most, I mean, maybe the most important. Y'all know that piece? It's a Chopin. Sorry. Actually, I played so well today. Anyway. Okay, so it has the two parts of it. It has the waltz part. Then it has the spinning part. Okay, so the great thing about this piece of music, what, John? Can you do better?
Yeah, probably. You want to try?
Please.
I think. I know my wife.
John has always been promising to do better. So anyway, I'm going to finish
You want to see that?
in the question and answer period.
We'll just hold that one.
When Chopin published this piece of music, on the front cover of the music was the phrase, "Please do not dance to this music." He meant you to sit down and dance to it, and at that point in time, he had declared the independence of the waltz from its relationship to the dance, to the beginning to the possibility of taking up the poetics and the piano. And if you listen carefully to the music, it has features in it that only the piano can play, and we want to look at why, and that make the piece of music an important piece of music in the waltz form, but not as a dance. And really, it's easy to do, and I won't belabor this, but, I mean, you know what had happened, two things. You know, the Funeral March. He'd written that. He was very interested in musical themes of death, and in particular, he liked Berlioz's introduction of the Dies Irae theme to the Symphonie Fantastique and some earlier work from this piece was written in 1847, and Berlioz introduced the Symphonie Fantastique in 1830. So this was a wait. So this is a Greek. I mean, this is a Gregorian chant. It's used in the death. We call those things the death. It's used in the Martyrs' Capital, but it's used in masses for the dead. And what Chopin was trying. Chopin is dying of tuberculosis. It's written in the year of his death, and he uses the magic of the piano to do two things. But if you listen to the inner voices, it's. So he's beginning to incorporate, and that's why he repeats the theme 3 times. So he'll go through first the folk thing, then the next time he plays it, so it goes. You're hearing the Dies Irae theme, and then beginning to see that the piece of music, the waltz theme as a possibility, is no longer connected at all to the question of the dance, but now it's not even connected to, I don't know, to the storytelling of the music in the sense that he's incorporating a poetics of the music. But what's really interesting to me, and what I think I'm going to try to produce, is what makes this music possible is an invention that occurred about the year of his birth. Wait a minute, I got it. Sit still, everybody. I know you're wanting to come up and help me, but I don't need your help. Okay, so there's two inventions I want to point out to you. There are actually a little over 65,000 registered patents for the piano registered between the year 1800 and 1900. 65,000 technical innovations in the improvement of the patent. One of them is this, I don't know if you can see it, but you see this wound steel. In other words, there was the technology that produced the steel. Can you see it's a big spring. Technology that produces the spring gives a resonant sound, and so all of a sudden the bass can be brought out. But the other one that's even more interesting, I think, is the key. As you know, the piano is composed of hammers. And there are 60 moving parts to get this thing up and down. I'm supposed to hold this and do this at the same time. Michael, come here. There's a piece. Show this thing over here. So it's a spring and release, so all of a sudden you can play faster and faster and faster, and it'll start to measure. But the key invention that makes Chopin's music possible is this cotton. He was the first composer to compose on a piano that used a felt instead of a wood hammer. And so he was able to get far more aural spectrum in the music. The combination of the steel development and the glue. The biggest invention was this red, I don't know if you can see it on side, this little red here, which allowed the felt to be reliably attached to the hammer. And so the entire sonority of the piano that allows the poetics to be possible is incorporated in the music of Chopin. He's the first person. It's not that he's a genius in the sense of independent from technological development, but a genius in the sense that he's taking advantage of the poetics of the technology that's available to him. Now, Belinda, to know that this thing can go back in, and there it goes. So, my point is this: if you're going to talk about a phenomenon, if you're going to ask yourself the question, "What is a waltz?" You basically can't give a phenomenology of the question, or you can't give the specificity of the question, because you can't account for the histories that start getting embedded into it. And it goes so far. The history keeps going, and I mean, normally I would play for you the Mephisto waltz, and it's where you hear where storytelling becomes explicit, and you hear a violin tuning up. Anyway, so he's going to tell a story about a waltz, in fact, about a devil who plays a violin and seduces a woman. And so the waltz becomes an opportunity no longer to be poetic, but to be storyteller, and it goes on and on and on. And there's, the last one I thought I would point out is one of the prepared pianos. These are waltzes by one of the prepared piano pieces by John Cage, which actually is possible because John, I knew him well, so I get to call him John, discovers the fact that by putting the pencils and the erasers in the, can you see that? So this is the pair. So this sound, which was identified earlier as a mistake on the piano, becomes a possibility of music because of the materiality of the piano and because of the history of the use of the materiality. So we have all the components in place, and that is the impossibility of a phenomenology to grasp the implications of a history. The phenomenology of film could never have imagined color, for example. The possibility, the significance of having to incorporate a material argument, which was not a phenomenological argument, but more importantly, the question of the disciplinary specificity being tied to a historical development of expertise. So that's the formula. I'm now going to show you some more slides to see if I can degrade that by showing work of my friends and then my own work. As you know, this always happens. There's a high point in a lecture where you think, oh, this is going to be good. Then I start to show the examples. It's always the same ones. It's, Peter Eisman, Greg Lee, oh God, that's not that shit again. And then I show my own work, and then it's over, and I'll get asked back for 10 more years. So. Thank you very, very much for putting up with this. One of the issues I wanted to make was the importance of expertise. I thought it was very important for my ineptitude to be evident for you so that you would understand how important it is to actually hear an expert playing the piano. So here we go. You can cut that off. Oh, I can cut that off. So this switch back to slides, and I'll take this out of Pascal's eyes. And so this is the key slide, I think, in the to-be-dressed issue of phenomenology of history. Because if you notice, I mean, the question I started to ask myself is this. It's really simple. Phenomenology is going to always ask for an essence and then look at how value is added to the essence. It's always going to be able to identify that which shouldn't change or is the core of a practice, and then be able to identify the added value and either bracket it off or celebrate it. Historical evolution gives us an opportunity to think of another way about that. And so in a certain sense, would you say that a human being is a chimpanzee with added value? So, I mean, the slide is important to me in that sense. But it's also, I mean, because you can't, think of how often the added value problem shows up in intellectual life. For Marx's theory was a theory of the value, labor theory of value. So it was the degree to which labor itself added value to the materials it worked with. Virtually every theory of ornamentation, basically all theories of value of dressing and fashion argue about added value. The body is naked, you add value to it. Now, I understand that Derrida has done an enormous amount to open up the problem of the deconstruction of the supplemental relationship, but actually that doesn't give us an answer to the problem of how can we use that question to answer the question of disciplinary specificity. If you'll notice, though, that shows up in this slide, which is the beginning of the dress. So is that there as ornamentation? Is that there as added value? Or is that there as the historic evolution of a new fundamentality in the work? And I think it's, I mean, obviously the person that drew that meant that to be the case because the use of tools is crucial to the question of the evolution of humanity. But more importantly for me, we don't see that. We tend to see that still as an ornament added to the body, and the body being essentially naked. So now, if you think a little bit about, let's say, the implications of dress. Not only are we dressed for an enormously short period of time, but dress and the fashion industry essentially produced modernity in the following sense. The following three industries come from the fashion industry. One is pharmaceutical. The entire pharmaceutical industry evolved out of the coal tar dye industry. The second one is plastics. All of plastics evolved out of the same industry. And the third one is computers. So the fashion industry, which inhabits our lives, which we stay intensely attached to in terms of how we get a job, who we marry, who has children, how we evaluate other people, what the economies are about, the micro-history of that are such that the extraordinary leap of intellection that would hold it to be a practice of ornamentation and not an essential practice is something I became curious to discuss. So anyway, I'll keep moving on. PowerPoint's not so hard. So if you're thinking about the architecture of the house and you're looking for the disciplinary specificity, then the whole argument about houses and functions and program goes away, because what's happening is that architects are discussing the possibility of producing architectural effects with one another in the same way that composers began to discuss producing new material effects, new organizational effects, new symbolic effects. It's a discussion among experts about a problem which becomes available through that discussion to another public. This is not an added value to that. So that, I mean, you can understand this discussion. There's Rem's synthesis of the Villa Savoye with the Philip Johnson glass house with the Mies van der Rohe Farnsworth house. And in that sense, there's no way to measure this as an architectural accomplishment in terms of how well it functions or what its relationship to the site is or what it's made of or how it's built. Its only argument is an irreducible effect in architecture, and that is producing this critical space of solving a certain kind of formal, material, and organizational problem. I don't want to go into it too much. I mean, the breakthrough in this is the sliding glass door at the bottom, which converts the Mies house into the Johnson house and resolves a great debate with a dynamic element, because Rem is interested to find out the possibility of introducing dynamics to the critical space of architecture. Peter Eisenman does something quite different, and that is the critical space of this building, which I'm going out of my way not to show you, is that it is a record of its process. This is a building, this is a house, which is built and occupied, but its architectural function is to record a process in a notational language so that the process, so the house is simply one step in the process. And I didn't show you the process for a reason, but notice that that carves out a different kind of critical space. It's not present. You either have to see the process or know the process, so it's not the same kind of critical space that the Rem is carving out. Now, this is a project by Wes Jones. It also is taking up an argument about Mies van der Rohe, but it also points out one of the real problems of working strictly at the representational or symbolic level of criticality, and that is he doesn't really know what to make the house of. So he knows he wants to comment on how it meets the ground, how he enters it, what the corners are. So you can, in each of these arrows is pointing to the place where he's discussing the previous work and making a, he has an idea, whatever the idea is. I mean, it would be interesting to do a lecture on West, but I don't want to. But he has a certain idea about supercharging. But what he doesn't know how to do is decide what to make the thing out of. And so he actually makes it implicitly out of rust. Basically, it's the only version of how do you show that this house is older than the houses I'm working on. But there's really no argument. So that goes back to a really fundamental problem that's really been interesting to me, and that is the intense interest in signification, and particularly in the success of the model of the collage. Signification doesn't require any materiality, doesn't require any specificity in terms of materials. It's dematerialized, representational, and therefore can never make an argument about medium specificity, because it cannot make an argument about materials. It doesn't mean that it can't use materials, but it can never be used to ground an argument in a historical medium specificity. This is one of my favorite slides, because obviously if you do collages, you're smarter than if you do brain stimulated by stimulated brain versus ordinary brain. And what's amazing now is, of course, the ordinary brain is the more popular image these days. It's sort of the new modernist image. Now, I mean, this is an important work of art. It achieves a certain criticality in its capacity to stimulate thought precisely by deterritorializing and aggregating in what's the word I'm looking for? In the discontinuity between the stool and its materials and the wheel, but the materials have no significance in there. It's entirely a critical act based in the symbolic domain. This is also a collage. It's amazingly interesting how collages produce knowledge by carving out this critical space. This is the collage, which, by the way, and I'm not showing this shocking animal rights thing. This is the collage which saved millions of lives by showing that smoking caused cancer. But this is probably the desperate limit of dematerialized abstraction, and ultimately what we're going to identify as the error of the concept of dematerialized perfect abstract knowledge which transcends all materiality. This is a slide made by IBM, when they moved atoms. So this is the first time we, using technology, have ever been able to manipulate matter at the scale of atoms, which I think that level of power over matter is probably the most promising achievement for the future I have ever conceived. But this is the most pathetic use of it I could ever imagine. All they could think of to do, once they could manipulate matter, was to line it up and turn it into an advertisement. Notice that. You don't need it to be as small as an atom to read IBM. You don't need it to be an atom. You can make it out of anything. So the capacity to, the power over matter is revealed in its utter triviality by the status of the dematerialized sign. I think this is maybe the cruxus of the moment in culture. We will also, this is probably the world's greatest bad building from postmodernism. This was a student of mine from Columbia, so you know, I have whatever legacies I have. I'm partly responsible for this. Whatever you think of this building, one thing you can see is that it doesn't really know. It doesn't know what to do with materials. It knows it needs one. You know, it's got to stand up. It's got to be there. It's got to be big. But it's basically works entirely at the level of symbolic life. This is its interior. That's a bit of a side, right? On the other hand, this is. I'm in the middle of making it, John. This is my dad, and I have violently and in fury murdered him. And this is the Wexner Center for the Arts, and it is often criticized as having no significant materiality. And I think its materiality is so specific as to be the best achievement of the period. If you notice, the model on the left and the building on the right are virtually identical because all of Peter's buildings are about building the model. In other words, in order to build that concept, that the entire architectural argument is in the concept of the process, it's crucial that the buildings themselves not stand with any materiality. And so it's basically built out of cardboard. And so when you go and you knock on this column, that's what it sounds like. And when Europeans do that, they just leave. That's it. If it doesn't sound like this, an angel. If it doesn't sound like that, they find it unbearable. But this is not dematerialized frustration about what to do with material. It's actually a perfect use of a contemporary architectural technology in the service of the architectural idea, although the idea was about the fact that ideas were dematerialized. This is the achievement of that. So that is the process that you see. Those are the drawings, the process drawings you see that produce House 6. Because of the way he designed that building, I was able to install this show so that the drawings, which are hung at 58 inches, fall off the sloped column. And as you're looking at them, you see them against the building in the background. So it's the critical argument that he's needing to make in terms of signification and its manipulations is brought to perfection, I think, in the building. And it's when I began to realize that the material, it's not going to belong to phenomenology or deconstruction or post-structuralism, that there is a way for every project to find its perfect materiality. This never made the news. This is the first molecule that IBM was, this is the first time they were able to produce atoms around and get them to join and become something else. And those colors that you see are the new emergent effects that came from that production. So they produced the model, something new happened, and it produced new performances. And the colors, I think, make the slide very different for us. They show a sensuality other than a signification. They engage us and speak to us in a different way. And part of the rest of this argument will be to construct a notion of sensual politics from this slide. Now, we're now going to go back. I've tried to put three things into play: the necessity of a historical argument, the irreducibility of architectural effects, and the inability to derive an argument of medium specificity from any phenomenology, including a phenomenology of performance, and the problem of added value. I think this is one of the best examples of added value, of the undoing of added value I've ever seen. I don't know if you can see this very well, but this is the story of O set in Gothic, biblical Gothic. And so Bruce Mau is looking at how the typography, inhabits the reception of the work to set its affective reception. It's disconcerting to read about "you'll never touch your breast in the presence of our bodice" when you're looking at biblical Gothic. Although the biblical Gothic disappears into the, while you're reading it, you don't look at the typesetting, and so it's not a question of added value, but it's also not a question of producing a critical presence in which you're paying attention to it. It actually does its work precisely by operating in another level of attention. And I guess that's the fourth issue I wanted to introduce tonight. As we begin to look at medium specificity, we have to start to criticize the idea of critical knowledge received in a receptive mood as the only form of knowledge, and start to argue, along with Deleuze, and I think he does this incredibly well in the Bacon book, that there are not only 1,000 forms of ontologies, but there are 1,000 forms of knowledge. Each belongs to a specific medium, and each produces a different body. So Bacon's argument, Deleuze's argument about Bacon is that Bacon, in painting itself, produces a different body, a body with ears and a stomach and lungs. Music produces a different body. So it's not a body which is then grounded through sensuality, either in science or in art, but it's the way each medium produces a different, actually a physically different body. To show this at work again in Bruce, this is the original cover for Bergsonism. It's, Dutch white modernism. Basically, the idea was that philosophy remains unaffected. This is the actual published cover of Bergsonism, which I think is actually, it's not only, it's gorgeous. This is really, I literally bought this book, took the cover off, hung the cover up, put the book away for years before I read it. But is it gorgeous in the sense of simply appealing to the pleasures of color or in the clouds? Is it like sitting in a pretty day and seeing clouds come through it? Because if that was the case, then we would have the following formula. We would have feeling and symbolic life. And therefore, feeling could never be critical, and therefore could never be historical, and could not become the subject of a materially specific practice. But in fact, it's not that. It's the Lartigue photo, which is then stretched and elongated, and colored with the spectrum of light shift. So it's actually something which is completely legible. If you understand the issues of Bergson's philosophy, it makes perfectly good sense to consider time and duration in the cover, and yet you have to look through that to get it. I mean, in other words, it's not about, it occupies a different critical space, even though it's an expert practice. Now, when Michael Hensel and Tom Verabez and I first started to talk about what were we going to, how were we going to think the question of medium specificity and materiality, our first attention thought we needed to think about construction and how you build things. Now, you don't know this, but we built this building in China. And it's kind of a nice building. We're real proud of it. It didn't get published very much. But the breakthrough, at the time we were thinking, how do we use materials in new ways? And we wanted to use these fluid, materials as fluid. So instead of designing it and then illustrating it, we decided to invent a completely new construction system. And what we did was built this, and then, to symbolize the end of an architecture that gets its messages from someplace else. And then if you can look up there, there's Tom setting the little charge, and then that's how we build this. And so we've come a long way. So I just wanted to remind these guys what the old days were like at the AA. This is a magazine that I hope you'll buy. This is a Visionaire. This is the latest edition of Visionaire. And like every magazine, you open it up and it's got pictures in it. But unlike most magazines, it not only opens up and you have pictures in it, it opens up and it has 20-something cents. So each of those things is a perfume, but it's an experimental perfume designed by a contemporary expert, each one of those is designed by a different perfumer to be an experimental perfume to produce a new scent. So the idea that scent itself would be outside of history, outside of expert practice, outside of politics. And also that there's a difference between the symbolic life of the image and the way scents are critical, I think makes this one of the most important magazines I've ever seen. Scents are critical precisely because of their medium specificity. They're also critical because they move through the body to the mind in a completely different way, but they're fully historical. The slide that used to be there before this is a slide of the list of roses that showed at the Hampton Court Rose Show last year. And every rose, 600 roses, not one of them was older than a year. Every rose that you see in a rose show has been produced by a rose breeder, and none of them get showed for longer than a year. So there's no place that you cannot see the historical issues are working, the specificity of the materials working, but also knowledge working at the level of expertise, as opposed to knowledge, materials being put in the service of producing a single transcendent knowledge. So the Thousand Plateaus are not just 1,000, are really about the fact that there are 1,000 forms of knowledge, each one specific, and none transcending into an idealized, dematerialized state. Now, at this point, I like to tell a story about the Capgras syndrome. Do y'all know Capgras syndrome? Probably the most important confirmation, I think, of Freud's theories of affect and ideation came from a neurophysiologist named V.S. Ramachandran. He solved the problem of Capgras syndrome. And the solution, which is, by the way, used by almost the entire psychoanalytic world to impugn Freud, actually confirms Freud's theories perfectly, but it gives us a piece of information we need. Capgras syndrome is this. Certain people, particularly they've been in accidents, they'll go home, they'll see their wife, they'll see their mother, their husband, and they'll say, this is an imposter. So they'll recognize them immediately, but they'll always say, this is an imposter. Later on, if the same person calls them on the phone, they'll say stuff like, God, you know, I had the worst day today. I went home and somebody was there pretending to be you. And it was an unsolved mystery for a long time. In fact, I learned about it on Unsolved Mysteries on TV. I don't know if but what was interesting about it was Ramachandran figured out this. He figured out that there were two moments to the recognition. There was the moment of ideation where the face was recognized by the facial recognition system, and then there was the moment of emotional confirmation, which is when the limbic system confirmed the correct emotional feeling for the image. And that in people with Capgras syndrome, that had been physically broken. So they would get the visual cue, but they would not get the affect confirmation, both of which you have to understand are historical. Obviously, the recognition of the face is historical, but also the emotional confirmation in the limbic system is symbolically, in a completely different way, shaped so that it confirms it. So because when you hear it on the phone, he recognizes the mother and the confirmation is there. So this break is interesting, but the thing that's even more important is it's not reported as confusion, it's reported as a story in terms of secondary revision. He doesn't say, I don't know who you are, I'm confused, how can you look like my mother and not be my mother? He knows exactly who it is, it's an imposter. And so he finds another emotional route. The disunity is unified into a new condition. And so basically all the components of Freud's thinking, I think, are there. The most important of which, and the one we've ignored the most, is the theory of affect, which is not a theory of mobilized, unshaped, unhistoricized phenomenological sensations of the body, but a completely different kind of history and a completely different kind of knowledge. And frankly, this is the expertise and the knowledge of affect. Now, so this is where it goes downhill, because I basically start to show friends of mine in my work. This is a sculpture by Roxy Payne and called Skumak, and a painting by David Reed, and they look to be formally oriented. This is my living room. It also says something very nice about Korb's table, I think. And I want to now look at what are the practices of expertise that are going to produce the kinds of issues that we're talking about, and that is medium specificity, but also carve out a new critical space. So this is I was trying to figure out what would my dog think about this. Is this going to appeal to him intellectually or affectively? The things you can do on PowerPoint. But it turns out that he makes these like this. So there's a machine that cranks these things out. There's a computer that controls the machine. Each one is slightly different. And so every one of these is different, and its difference comes from the combination of the information used to construct it and the material that's being used. And they're all, but at the same time, they form a species. So it solves one of the more interesting problems, and that is producing same and difference within a species as opposed to same and difference constructed by collage, which violates territorial boundaries. for me, all of a sudden, I began to get an insight into how this work could actually solve one of the great unsolved political problems, I think, that architecture and other thought faces. And in order to do that, I wanted to turn to my favorite English theorists. I don't know if you know them. They actually work as a team. They rarely write books. They usually tell their theories through parables. And so I've actually digested for you. But they present, I think, one of the great conundrums in material argument. So here it is, and I'll just let it speak for itself. This is from the movie The Life of Brian. It says, "Listen to me, you've got it all wrong. You don't need to follow me, you don't need to follow anyone, you're all individuals." They all respond, "Yes, we're all individuals." "You're all different." "Yes, we're all different." At this point, I'm starting to think, okay, this is an important problem. And then, of course, a new theorist entered the field, and he says, "I'm not." You can watch him saying this. This is the thing. Isn't that great? Like, I never could do that in a slideshow before. So this is a collection of Greg Lynn's teapots. Now, he set out to make a teapot whose qualities were that every teapot would be different from every other teapot, but they would all join into a species. So they would have sameness and differences in a completely new account of what constitutes the same and what constitutes the difference. But what's even more important is, in order to achieve that, two things are required: an inordinate amount of specificity and expertise that you never are going to detect as recovered indexical knowledge, because it's all about producing a kind of affective sensuality at the individual level. So this work does something which I think the work that we've seen prior to this by Rem, that generation, is doing something really interesting, like the Roxy Payne. At the level of the individual object, it's all about a kind of uncritical sensuality, but the process doesn't matter. But the space of criticality is constructed by the ensemble of all the existing things, which only can be held where such thinking is probably appropriately held, and that is in the apparently dematerialized condition of reflective space. So each piece is sensuous and about the production of affect, and yet it becomes critical not in its historical references, not in making presence like the Rem Koolhaas does with Mies van der Rohe, but in constructing a completely new ensemble and conceptual space in which its critical dimensions unfold. And I've been really interested in lots of, like, this is Rauschenberg's Erase de Kooning. In order for this to work in the field, he actually had to frame it in an ironic way and put the little title at the bottom. If you look closely, you can still see legacies of the erasure. This is a slide that's out of place because I don't know how it got there, but that's Wes Jones. But it's kind of funny. It shows the possibility of creating an added value effect. In other words, he needs to make the shage present in order to make his critical argument about the change in history available to you. So in order to make his argument present, he has to make the sign of the Korb shades present in order to add his technological supercharging. And that makes the critical space both historical, but in the presence of the object, which leaves you with no discussion of what he should do with the shades. You might as well use the same one. It could have been anything. This is Tom Friedman's work. I don't know if you know this, from '92. The new work is so much more interesting than this. But this is the erased Playboy centerfold. Now, which it's such an incredible work. First of all, look how it's pinned up. And look at its willingness to let go of its historical presencing, but at the same time, the utter difficulty of erasing a Playboy centerfold, both libidinally and physically. And if you remember, de Kooning was famous for his paintings being nudes. And so it operates at such a profound level of not needing to make presence any signification, but allowing that to operate utterly in an utterly conceptual space while making completely present basically its own emptiness. You know this is the Factum 1 and 2, I don't know, by Robert Rauschenberg. It's one of the great paintings in the history of painting. It was great because there was an argument about the immediacy of the mark and the capacity of the mark to existentially confirm the singularity of the artist, these abstract expressionist marks. And so he did one of his collages, but he did something really amazing, and that is he made two paintings in which the gesture is identical, absolutely identical. And so critiquing the idea of the immediacy of the mark in abstract expressionism and its relationship to existential thought. One got bought. This is such a great story of institutional histories trying to protect their collections. In an agreement that has now been exposed and nullified, one of these paintings got bought by MoCA in Los Angeles, and the other one got bought by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, so that their abstract expressionist collections were protected from this violent assault on the impossibility of them being able to be sustained. I'm just teasing about it. One got bought by MoCA, one got bought. So they just recently agreed for 6 months ago to show them 6 months together in one institution and 6 months together in another. It turns out that they're not, this is PowerPoint. Turns out they're not identical. He's not as good as you think he is. He's pretty close though. This is Tom Friedman's two pieces of paper identically crumpled. So during this period of time, he was obviously reflecting on that work. But again, it's what is the artistic achievement of letting go of the presencing of the history in order to create a critical condition? This work is actually a favorite work of my students who have no idea who Robert Rauschenberg is and think he lived at the time of Palladio, because they only have two periods of history, these days and long, long ago. And now, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. This is Jeff Koons' balloon dog and mirror, half moon mirror. This piece weighs about 360 pounds. It's $1 million in production to get the surface such that it looks like it's plastic. It's operating, I think, in an utterly it's in invocations of paidomorphism, of infantile or adolescent sexuality. And it's basically performing an incredibly interesting trick, and that is it completely apparently abdicates criticality in order to find a new space of criticality behind it. It's one of the great works of art. It also solves one of the most amazing formal problems. But it's not a conceptual piece in its expertise. It's an expert in its material practices. And so the entirety of the effort is to figure out how to make this. Okay, so where is expert work now being done in architecture? What are the modes of research? And towards what end? Are they engaging materials to produce material effects? Are they sidestepping the added value problem? Are they taking up the problem of multiple forms of knowledge, many of which occur in non-attentive modes? And I think you can see, if you look across the field, that basically it's in a debate which engages three conditions of, we used to call this surface, but there are now three areas that are being the research is competing in three set of effects produced by surface. There's surface, skin, and screen. So, for example, surface problems, this looks like it refers to the Mies, obviously, by Preston Cohen, who'll be here next week, but he's treating this entirely as a question of the material possibilities engaged of surface. So this is a surface project, and it will oftentimes make its references most explicitly to histories, but instead of being an assembly of parts, it's looking at the possibility of a surface to behave topologically. So topological projects are no longer about blobs, they're about surfaces, and surfaces are not skins, and skins are not screens. Skins are buildings that use microsection to produce a completely different argument. A microsection simply means to do this. Within a very shallow space of the skin, the operation of dimensionality produces a completely different effect than a surface. And so I'm simply introducing this to distinguish us. This is a skin problem because this is Neutling. I guess Neutling's was here. I don't know how we discussed this. But it's crucial to see just through this shallow surface. So the screen effect is the airplanes, but you look to this section through it to get a dimensionality, but it's only operating at a very, it used to be called shallow space in painting. This is a screen project. This is a project in which the entire argument is loaded in producing an apparently dematerialized effect of the screen. Now, you don't look through this, you look at this, and it means that the building operates in a completely different conceptual space. So I think skin, screen, and surface problems are actually occupying these three critical spaces identified for you before. The historical space, the space of conceptual criticality, and the space of apparently pure pleasure. This is a building, I think you see all three operating at the same time. The concrete is the surface. There's this little tile thing. I don't know if I can get these little tiles over here, which have this microsectional effect. And the thing I like most, which is this rigid fiberglass, what do you call that stuff? Insulation. And it actually is the screen. So as you're looking through the building, you can actually see the building produce its three sensual politics, none of which can be said to be phenomenological and not, all of which are materially specific, but each of which operates a different critical space all the way from judgment to affect. As far as I'm concerned, the more interesting sensual political response to the god-awful buildings in red brick is the building implied by the yellow screen surface. It's interesting for me to see how do architects work through the problem of what expertise is. In this case, it's clear that the important thing is not form or not historical argument, but shape, surface, and how to create the screen effect. I'm going too long, but all of this argument about Don and Peter's building in Melbourne seems to be about its form and its apparent questions about Danny, but actually it's an astonishingly successful building working at the problem of skin. The entire architectural argument as you go up to it is this microsection. You can see it there where thin layer, the architecture is exactly this thick, but the entire production of its architectural argument as opposed to its formal argument occurs in that micro. And this is an easy one. This is a skin project on the surface and a surface project in the plan, in the plates. So you can start to see the way the two are skin in the sense that the microsection is important. I'll skip these. And just to kill myself as always, so this is the project in which I'm going to be trying to put some of these arguments together. This is, I'm interested in, how can I use arguments about skin, screen, and surface to think about the way the material specificity of architecture produces different kinds of critical awareness. This is a nightclub. This is called the Black Flame Nightclub. This screen, as you walk closer and closer and closer, produces not a moire effect, but a reveal and unreal effect. You can imagine it. But the cartoon quality of each of the floor plates and in the nightclub is basically to detach that from any of its historical argument. So we continue to develop this in a second project. And if you'll notice in the lower right-hand corner, each of my studios takes up the work of the last studio and continues to make an argument about it. This is a planetarium where the project started off with the kind of Greg Lynn blob problem, working with box and blocks. And we were working on a thing called the bleb. And we were trying to figure out how do we use some of these arguments about surface and skin. So we made this model in which the internal blob, which was about a form, is done in Christmas balls, basically to turn it into a screen. So we needed to find an effect that even though it's this shape, if we treated the surface differently, we could stop people from thinking about the effect, about the form, and allow the form to operate in a completely different. This is sort of drawn from Jeff Koons's ideas. So the next idea, though, is you understand the real problem for us is these intersections. And so we needed a skin trick which allowed us to produce complex, crenellated, formal intersections that no one would ever interpret as formal manipulation. In other words, no one would interpret as surface. Once you're looking at a surface in contemporary architecture today, or form, you're looking at a surface. And so we've decided to build this building in a sort of pop art quotation of candy wrappers so that we can hide all of the, and if I were to show you these forms detached from that, it would read like any blob project with a bleb intersection. But the screen effect allows us to hide all of the difficult formal issues and joinery behind this adolescent effect, and I think construct a completely new space of criticality for architecture. Thank you. Sure. Oh, you see, okay. John left now. Now that I was ready to go after him, he's gone.
Have we got the microphone now?
Oh.
Can we have some questions?
Anybody want an original time? Question? Come on. Indulge me. Make your ass question. Wow. So I know you don't have it. But if you have one, what would it be? These are teachers. I mean, I'm not kidding. If you were going to make up a question, what would it be? Help it. Well,
okay.
You have the floor.
Sorry, you don't have
I'll repeat it for you.
Actually refers to your first comment, which is I like the inference of an apologia with respect to the what I think Rem called the semantic nightmare. How do you? It's a very general question, I'm afraid, but
okay.
How do you feel about? How do you feel now? I mean, perhaps trying to put it more specifically about your complicity in that semantic nightmare.
The question was, given your brilliant career, why aren't you the chairman, the dean of an important school? I feel, here's the answer. I feel well paid for having done it. I tried to show in the Wexner Center and some other projects the fact that certain really important achievements were accomplished. But more important, if you believe in expertise in historical research, you have to understand that a failed project is just as important as a successful project. I think had we not done that, we would have labored under a certain kind of phenomenology, materiality, which would have meant bricks and courtyards. And I think we now know how to go back and look at that work and extend it, recover from it in a certain sense. I mean, you know, you saw the Nissan thing, you know, the Ionic thing. Is it really that bad that it's there? After all, it's stuck away in Japan. You don't have to go see it, you know. So, I mean, the nice thing about architecture is it's incredibly tolerant of experiments and mistakes. I mean, I hope after tonight you're not, you know, you're not measuring your successes in either of the two terms that we talked about. You know, its validity in terms of adding value to program, or its capacities to, you know, basically produce dematerialized arguments. But you know, I just don't think we could have gotten to where we were today without it. Just like Einstein couldn't have gotten to the relativity theory without the Michelson-Morley experiment being a null result, another a failed experiment. I don't know, what are y'all thinking about here? You know, I walk around the AA. The AA is such a creepy place. You know, I come here, you know, I haven't been here in 10 years. I walk in, there's, you know, Tony Fresnel and Carl. I mean, it's like no face has changed, you know, but all, but you know, you have Peter Salter teaching blobs on computers. You know, I don't know. It's such a strange place, and I'm never really, you know, I follow your work when I follow the publications, but it's never quite clear what the AA is about. I mean,
this is actually a kind of sad outbreak of Capgras syndrome.
You know what? Mark must have an early dinner reservation.
More questions?
Or complain. I mean, I'm sort of complaining about the AA. You know, let's have a council meeting, or what do you call it?
No, it's not called a council meeting. And
okay.
A question? Well, come on. Brian, you remember the person whose hand used to go up?
And to ask whether it's not a case simply that in attempting each time to produce a description of essence, phenomenology produces a description of a state. The states go through transitions, which could also be compared to translations. And so that it's not that phenomenology is incompatible with history, it's that it describes a certain moment in the hermeneutic process when the possibility of transition.
Well, that's true.
Translation
The problem is not the discourse of phenomenology, which I think you've accurately described, but the capacity of the discourse of phenomenology to be used to ground an architectural project, which I think, much like we didn't do a good job at using a certain version, an abuse of poststructuralism to ground a certain architectural problem, we didn't do a very good job using a version of phenomenology, which has its own materiality, the text. And in other words, we basically represented it instead of re-originated. I didn't talk about the discourse of re-origination. So there was no way to be an expert in architecture through phenomenology any more than there was a way to be an expert in architecture through any of the other discourses that we were used. And so I think you're correct in the understanding the problems. I mean, phenomenology as a philosophical discourse did have its own failings. In particular, its unitary understanding of the body. And we now know, for lots of reasons, that both philosophically and scientifically and artistically can't be sustained. But the idea that phenomenology described a state, that it would bracket out a state, a moment in history as a state, that state then would operate to produce a discourse of judgment in the field. And I think you can't deny that. Even if it never meant to, it would produce an argument about what was added value, what was not, what was essential to the field, what was not. The material argument, one of the great things to do is to read the material, either the Marxist or materialist arguments in film, either the phenomenological arguments or the Marxist arguments in film, which are trying to figure out the materiality of film. And then watch how a film expert works. There's a film, I don't know, is it playing here? Is Cooler playing here? The film Cooler? You'll see it. It'll come, it's got Bill Macy. And basically, he's a person who has the capacity to end a run of good luck in Las Vegas. So he's hired by the casino, he's such a dreadful person that if he stands by a table, he ends a run of good luck. And of course, this is a great movie because what happens is he falls in love. And because he's fallen in love, he all of a sudden spreads good luck everywhere. It's, you know, the kind of movie you really want to see. But you're watching this movie, and one of the things that occurs in the film, and you will not see it, but it's incredibly effective, is the following transition. While he's a cooler, the wardrobe specialists have dressed him in awkward colors and in a suit that doesn't fit. It's 4 sizes too large. And as he moves to fall in love, the suit's exactly the same suit. The thing that changes the shirt and the tie and the size. It starts to fit better and fit better and fit better, and the color combinations becomes more effective. And by the time he's effectively working in love and giving everybody good luck. In the film, the expert practice of wardrobe has produced a relationship to the character that you're completely unaware of, but it's operating in a way that I think no phenomenology could grasp except after the fact. So if we now go and do a phenomenology of film and its expert practices, we would include wardrobe, we would include color, we would include sound, we would include music, we would include all sorts of stuff, but we would not be able to predict the histories, the micro-histories that then would evolve that again. So, and that's why the expert practices in those kinds of things don't indulge those discussions. It doesn't mean, the autonomy is not, let's go back to when architects only talked about architects. That's not the argument at all. The argument is, what experiments are producing new irreducible effects in the medium? That's it. And then the critical and metacritical discourse will obtain from that. Anyway, thank you.
Hang on. There's a question here from Michael Hensel, who was a kind of early victim in his career of working for Jeff.
You started the lecture with a discussion about the shift in spatial organization, comparing two buildings, and then moved to quickly to material effect and the microsection or the sectional aspect that actually deals with the material envelope in different variations. And I wonder whether that could be tied back to a different possibility of spatial organization, what the spatial argument then would be. Because, I mean, Herzog de Moon,
yeah, spatial, look, I mean, I've been out all day. I spent, say, an afternoon at the Design Research Lab. I mean, no, what do you call it? Yeah, DRL. It was a lot of fun. Everybody's asked about space. You know, I hear it, the spatial organization of space. And basically, I spent a lot of time saying it's just a nonsense idea. In the following senses, and I don't mean to be insulting because I think it's important. Space is an effect. It's an after effect. It never can be the thing you're trying to achieve. Just like health is an after effect. You don't want to go to a doctor and say, I'm feeling bad. What can you do for me? And have him say, I can make you healthy. What you want him to say is, I can do an MRI, put you on a drip. I have 50 expert things to do. And then you know that the result of that will be some notion of health. In architecture, we're not running experiments to constantly produce a new spatial organization. I think if anything was done, if any mistake that ever happened in the research, the datascape and the hyperindexical effect as new organization, that was the most dead-end body of research that I endorsed. I don't even mention it anymore because, unfortunately, I can't even say it produced anything good. So I think basically you conduct architectural experiments about certain issues that you're discussing with other architects, and then the spatial effects of those arise later. If otherwise if there was an essential argument of spatial effects, everything you would be doing would be added value to that.
My question was not so much a kind of purposeful construction of spatial organization, but rather spatial effect coming from a particular way of working.
Yes, I mean, I tried to.
Envelope.
I mean, for me, look, I'm never going to talk to you about the performance in any other terms but the architectural performance. But the screen, the skin, and the surface are three modes of experimenting with architectural performance that produce interesting architectural effects in three different spaces. One has to do with the critical presence of the work. The other one has to do with carving a space of non-material criticality and comparison. And the other one has to do with this kind of direct production of the sort of, what's the word I was looking for? Pleasure, hidden pleasure and criticality, the perfume. Now, the microsection, I think, is the one that's the most attractive to architects today. I really do, because it retains a legacy of depth and thickness. Do you remember Rafa Meneo's lecture at Harvard, his inaugural lecture at Harvard, where he says, I want to talk to you tonight about sickness and death? And it was about halfway through the lecture before we realized he meant thickness and depth. But that's the longest legacy. For me, the problem that's most interesting is the screen. Not the screen in the sense of putting a screen on a building, but architecturalizing the screen. And, you know, so the brilliance, I think, of Herzog and de Meuron's work is that the plan, the capacity of the work to inhabit the spatial organization is utterly nullified in order to sustain the architectural effect. So, any other questions? Okay.
It's kind of Capras again. I mean, I was thinking it looked like
No,
Michael Hensel, but had it been, I mean, you'd have known better than to ask you. That's not the question I asked you.
Here's a, you know, Capgras is sort of old hat now, y'all know it. There's a new syndrome. I swear to God, look it up on your web. Look up Ramachan, the same thing. Here's an interesting syndrome. There are people that come and report themselves as being dead. Because they actually say, I'm dead. They're not sad about it. But what's happened is the nervous network, which connects the limbic system to the identity system, is entirely severed. So they have no affective confirmation of any experience, none hearing, smelling. And so their secondary revision has produced the obvious, logical, lived conclusion that they're dead. So they go to their doctor and say, I'm dead. Now, that's more interesting than Capgras. I just forgot the name of it. Good night.
Okay, well, I'd like to... Okay.
I did it in an hour.
You didn't?
Yeah. God, I left out so much stuff. So do you teach the...